Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to a new video by Forgotten History. It's been a while since I last uploaded, but inshallah I'll be uploading more, and I'm uploading today. Today I'm going to be discussing the topic of early Islam. So just a quick heads up, I have been recently studying at university. I'm studying history and political economy, and one of my key modules, so I'm doing only the medieval module, is early Islam. So this is not only just to help me, hopefully help you who are watching this video, and to teach other people new things. So I'm aiming to help my peers who are also studying history, maybe history and political economy, whether that be in university level or lower level, but also to teach others about early Islam. So I'm mainly going to go from the Prophet's revelation to Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. I'm not going to go past the point around 670 when you get to some of the fitna with Hussein and Yazid and the massacre that took place there. I'm not going to go into that, but I'm mainly going to be talking about early Islamic civilization and how this impacts us today. This is not going to be too long of a video, but it's going to be longer than my usual videos. It's almost like a podcast style video. I'm trying to get my Forgotten History podcast up and running again, hopefully, inshallah. Just a couple of announcements. Thank you guys for around 350 subscribers, I think, maybe 365. Jazakallah khairan. And I've also started a TikTok. I started that before I uploaded my last proper video, because obviously the last video on this channel was when I had my interview with Proper, but that wasn't like a historical video. My other video which I uploaded was just before I started my TikTok. So I started my TikTok now, Forgotten History 8, make sure to follow that up. I post Islamic history videos, Eastern history videos, and yeah, I make African history videos as well. So make sure to check that out. It's a lot shorter content as well than this type of content. From now on, my history videos on this channel will mainly be longer style videos, almost like podcasts. So put your headphones in, do whatever you're doing, and listen on to what I'm going to teach you about early Islam. So we start in around 610 AD. So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam received his first revelation from Angel Jibreel in Mount Hira. So this is in Mecca, of course, where the Prophet was living. Around this time, so at this time, you had the Romans. I think I've got a map somewhere here. So this is actually an Ottoman map. So around here, you'd have the Romans, and around here, you'd have the Persians. And here is Saudi Arabia, sandwiched in between two major world superpowers. And at the time, Saudi Arabia was mainly left alone due to the fact that it was seen as almost impossible to rule. This was because it was of its geography, it was a complete desert. And secondly, it was because with all the Bedouin nomadic tribes, they'd be moving around, so they were hard to tax, because you can tax them one time, you lose them, you never find them again, you can't tax them again. So it was kind of left alone. You had some religions, you had Christianity, Judaism, and there was Christian tribes, Jewish tribes in and around Saudi Arabia, but mainly the region was very much a pagan region, which means they worshipped idols. Pagan now has different connotations, but at the time it means that they worshipped idols. And as well as this, you look at pre-Islamic Arabia, there was a lucrative business in terms of selling idols. So this is actually going to be a key part to why Islam was able to grow, but was also persecuted in the beginning. So Prophet Muhammad ﷺ receives his revelation. He goes to his wife Khadija radiallahu anha, who believes him, and she became the first Muslim. And then you had the likes of Abu Bakr, Uthman, Ali, Zayd radiallahu anhu, who converted. Radiallahu ta'ala anhu is how Muslims refer to the Sahaba. Sahaba refers to the companions of the Prophet, the close friends of the Prophet, many of whom, four of whom would become Caliph. And actually, technically Muawiyah is considered Sahaba as well, but not on the same level as the likes of Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali radiallahu ta'ala. So getting into how Islam began to spread, it mainly began to spread in secret, because Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he didn't immediately, it wasn't like he sort of had the revelation and immediately every single person in Arabia would convert. It wasn't like that. It mainly started happening in stages, slow stages. But when more and more people started finding out, Muslims began to get persecuted. This was mainly because the people who worshipped idols at the time, a lot of them were rich business owners who made a lot of money from selling idols, and they didn't want this to affect their business. Also, a lot of people were quite content on worshipping idols, right? Because it's all they had ever known. They didn't really know. They knew about Jesus and Judaism at the time, maybe from some sources, but no one actually was religious in that area, right? So that's where you sort of get where Islam is coming into. It's coming into that sort of environment. And a lot of the slaves who were converting, like Bilal radiallahu ta'ala anhu, was persecuted so extremely because of his Islam, to the point where they put a rock on his back and forced him to renounce Islam, but he did not renounce Islam. For the more he was tortured, he kept saying La ilaha illallah. And when I say a rock, I mean a boulder, and they left him to burn in the sun. And then an interesting story that I'm going to touch on, this will of course link to how early Islam began to strengthen, is the fact there was a strong brotherhood in the fact that they were minorities. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu purchased Bilal as a slave and said, even if you had offered so the slave owner said to Abu Bakr, even if you had offered 1 ounce of gold, I would have sold him. And Abu Bakr said, even if you had told me to offer you 100 ounces of gold, I would have bought him. So it's that sort of brotherhood, because Bilal was a slave, yet he was still a Muslim. And that value of being a Muslim at the time for the other Muslims was so high, there was no price on it, you understand? So early Muslims were mainly persecuted in Mecca. They were killed, some of them were killed, like Sumayya radiallahu anhu, who was unfortunately killed in one of the most brutal fashions, which I'm not going to discuss in this video. And they were boycotted. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ couldn't do business because he was boycotted. He was sort of ousted from public view. His Sahaba, they were also boycotted. They couldn't buy food, to the point where they couldn't buy food that their droppings looked like the droppings of animals because they were eating the leaves of trees and plants. And despite the fact that they were persecuted and boycotted, many people did come to Islam. Why is this? One is because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was considered a very, very honest man, to the point that people would trust him even if it seemed completely unexpected at the time. So he was very much a truthful and honest man, and that brought people to Islam. The fact that the messages, it resonated with a lot of people at the time. They said, why are we worshipping idols when there's something that created all of this? And Islam offered a logical explanation to that. And I think thirdly is because a lot of the people at the time, when you see the beauty of the Quran, the poetry, the fact that an illiterate man, like the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ at the time was an illiterate man when the Quranic revelation came to him, he was able to come up with this. That's what also drove many people to Islam. So this was early Islam, and they were eventually, the Muslims were persecuted and forced out of Mecca and forced to go to a place called Yathrib, or now known as Medina. And they were in Medina for around 10 years. This was the 10th year of the Islamic calendar, and it's known as Dhull Hija, the year of the Hijra. And this is when they migrated from Mecca to Medina. And during this period, they settled there, and many of the Madanis, so the people known also as the people of Ansaris, converted to Islam. So you had people like Ayyub al-Ansari who converted to Islam and was one of the longest living Sahabas, even to the point of Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ lived in Medina for many years, and during this time they still fought wars against the Quraysh, who were the main power in Mecca at the time. And a quick note is that whilst there was tribal wars going on between the Muslims and the Quraysh, etc., the Romans and the Persians still dominated each side, and they didn't care much for the new religion that was coming out of Mecca or Medina, because it didn't really offer them a threat at the time. And eventually the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, they fought in a battle called the Battle of Badr, which they won. This was the first major victory of Islam against the Quraysh, and it showed a slow power shift towards the Muslims. And there were some battles which Muslims consider victories but were losses in a general term, like the Battle of Uhud, which was a battle on a mountaintop, which was a huge massacre and a huge devastation for the Muslims at the time. The Prophet's uncle Hamza radiallahu anhu was killed in a brutal fashion also. And you see the military genius of a man known as Khalid ibn Walid on the Quraysh side, despite the fact that Khalid ibn Walid would eventually convert to Islam and almost be one of the greatest commanders of all time. So at this time you had early Islam. So early Islam, what were we having? You have wars with the Quraysh, and you had people converting in Medina. Also the Prophet sent people into Ethiopia or Abyssinia at the time, and some of the people in Abyssinia were converting to Islam, and the people in Abyssinia were allowed to live peacefully. Most notably, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, Ali radiallahu anhu's brother, lived peacefully in Abyssinia for many years until he returned to Medina eventually to see the Prophet. So you had all these battles and you had all this war until eventually the Prophet conquered Mecca. So the Prophet conquered Mecca in around 630, some people say 631, and when they conquered this land, it was a huge victory for the Muslims. Now the Muslims, the Prophet who was exiled from his home, who was persecuted from his home, who was tortured in his home, had now returned. What was he going to do to the people who exiled him, tortured him and persecuted him? Absolutely nothing. He let them live freely and did not harm them, did not harm their business. He said, you must pay a tax and you must identify that now I am the ruler of these lands. That's it. And subhanallah, that shows the sort of leadership that the Prophet had offered and had shown. And after the Prophet's unfortunate death, of course, in 632, he passed on the caliphate. So the caliphate now, so after the Prophet's death, they had consolidated much rule in the whole of Arabia, not just Mecca and Medina, but much of Arabia. And the caliphate was now in the hands of a man named Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, who was the best friend of the Prophet. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu didn't rule for that long, but during this period he mainly consolidated his rule. He sorted out tribal issues, and you see the beginnings of early Islamic civilization. It's only really when you get into the rule of Umar radiallahu anhu, who succeeded Abu Bakr, that you see the huge sort of rise of Islam and conquest of different regions, that you familiarize yourself with early Islamic conquests. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu died and the caliphate was now passed on to Umar. So the caliphate, the caliph, is just merely a title of a ruler of the Islamic world at the time. The Prophet was the Prophet. There's no other prophets after Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But the caliphate, the caliph, was seen as the person who will now rule over the ummah, who will have the say, who's allowed to call for war, etc., etc. And Umar radiallahu anhu was now the caliph. So you have all these conquests. I think the actual dates was 644. So Umar ruled for 10 years. Abu Bakr ruled from 633 to 632 to 634, and Umar ruled from 634 to 644, so 10 years. And during this reign, he consolidated the whole of Arabia. He dealt with tribal feuds. He conquered much of Egypt, Syria, and all these lands that are now known as the Middle East. But it's not merely, he conquered these lands. He defeated the Roman Empire, one of the most powerful empire of all time at the time. He completely destroyed the Persian Empire. The Sassanid Empire was gone like this. Because why? Because Umar radiallahu anhu had conquered them. It wasn't just Umar. It was actually the military genius of Khalid ibn Walid which conquered most of these lands. And of course other Sahaba. But it was this period of time where you see the sort of rise of Islam, the expansion of Islam, the sort of power that the new religion displayed. And to give some background, the Byzantine Empire, so the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantines at this time, they were most likely known as the Byzantines, was beginning to consolidate their rule just prior to the rise of Islam. Just prior to the rise of Islam, they had just taken out massive loans and consolidated with their rule. But due to the bubonic plague of around the 600s, it destroyed their economy. So this kind of made it easier for Islam. Not saying it was easier by any means necessary, because the Roman Empire was still nonetheless the most powerful empire. They were fighting with the Persians for how many years? But it allowed for a rise of Islam in a region which no one thought possible. It was a once in a lifetime opportunity. And Islam took this opportunity and conquered the entire region. After this, you have the unfortunate assassination of Umar by a guy named Abu Lu'lu, who was actually a Persian at the time, who was a Zoroastrian, who unfortunately assassinated Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And after his assassination, so prior to his assassination, there was also schooling systems in place, there was laws in place, there was he was actually the man who but made sure that Tarawih was prayed by all people, because at the time in Ramadan, of course, now we all Muslims pray Tarawih every single night, right? But the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in Ramadans, he prayed Tarawih the first night, the second night, and the third night he did not come out, because he felt that if he came out, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would make it obligatory on all Muslims to pray Tarawih. And Tarawih is seen as not as an obligatory prayer. So Umar said, why are we all praying individually? Let's all pray together for Tarawih. And you get sort of that type of the schools of thought that is seen as today, like the Hanafi, Hanbali, Maliki, Shafi'i. None of that was in place at the time, because this was much later on, when you get to the 800, 700s. That's when you see the schools of thought forming. Because right now there was no schools of thought. Right now there was beginnings of just basic fundamentals of Islam that was there. This is how we run a state. This is how we conquer. This is the Islamic values that we follow. Just war, no killing civilians. And to be honest, Islam, when they came in, conquering these lands, it was that which no one had ever seen before. The Jewish people were allowed to live peacefully. They were never allowed to live peacefully in the Roman lands. Ever. They were persecuted for thousands of years. They were persecuted under the Romans, the Byzantines, everyone. The Jewish people were allowed to live peacefully in Islamic lands as long as they paid the jizya. Jizya means the tax of living in Muslim lands. And they were given protection. Often scholars from Jewish lands would have better writings while living in Islamic lands than in any other lands during this time. And you also had a sort of Arabization. Is that the right word? Arab. I feel like I'm giving the wrong word. But now people were beginning to write more in Arabic, because this is the language that the Quran was being written in. Note that the Quran was not fully codified at the time of Umar radiallahu anhu. It was actually codified at the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, which I'll go on to in a moment. So you had that sort of, basics of Islam, and you had the beginning of civilization, and you had a lot of conquest. So now there was huge amounts of conquest. They needed governors. Umar radiallahu anhu was assassinated in a masjid, actually, and he gave 8 people to become to be options with the caliph. And eventually Uthman radiallahu anhu became the caliph, and he ruled for around 12 years. During his rule, you saw again a beginning of rise of Islam. You had the first few naval expeditions of Islam. You had governors being put in place in different regions, and the most important thing is the Quran was finally codified and was printed, and that Quran was given around to everyone, because this took just 20 years after the Prophet's death. Where you look at the Bible, 300 years after Jesus' death, the Bible was kind of codified and verified and whatever. 20 years after the Prophet's death by people who knew him. And I think that's what separates Islam from a lot of religions, is that 20 years after the Prophet's death, the whole Quran, which was memorized by all these Sahabas at the time, of course, was now displayed, and everyone was able to read it. And interesting stories during Uthman's reign is you had expansion far in Northern Africa, as well as they started pushing into Europe at the time, into nearly getting into Turkey. And modern day Turkey, of course, was Anatolia, and this was seen as the last Byzantine stronghold now, because they'd taken all of Syria, they'd taken all of Iraq, which was Persian, but they'd taken all of Syria, all of Jerusalem, all of Lebanon, modern day Lebanon. I'm giving modern day examples. But unfortunately for Uthman radiallahu anhu, many people in his own sort of support circle began rioting against him, and unfortunately this was known as the first fitna, the first time the Muslims had killed another Muslim. Of course it might have happened in the past, but genuinely had killed a leader of Islam. And Uthman was unfortunately assassinated by a group of many people. And a beautiful story about this, however, is that the night of Uthman's death is that he is narrated that he had a dream where he saw the Prophet ﷺ with Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu and Umar radiallahu anhu saying, "Join us, it's your time today." And he got everyone out of his house. He was eventually assassinated in his own house. This is known as the first fitna. Then you had Ali radiallahu anhu, who became caliph, and many people believed he should have been the first caliph, but he was in fact the fourth caliph. And this was around 656 that he took the helm. And when he became caliph, he did not immediately go after Uthman's killers, and this was to the much of the displeasement of many figures at the time, including Muawiyah and Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and many others at the time. This was mainly because within his own sort of support system, within the whole state at the time, Uthman radiallahu anhu's murderers was within that. So it was virtually impossible for him to just go in and take them out. But he did not go in after them, and this was to the displeasement of many of the high-ranking people at the time. And you get many battles such as the Battle of the Camel and the Battle of Siffin. The Battle of Siffin, the latter which was fought between Muawiyah radiallahu anhu and Ali radiallahu anhu. So Muawiyah, to explain his story, was the son of Abu Sufyan. Abu Sufyan was just simply a trader, but it was a persecutor of early Islam. He was very much a persecutor of early Islam. However, he eventually converted to Islam later on, after the conquest of Mecca. Many people did convert to Islam after the conquest of Mecca. And his wife Hind was one of the women. It was the woman who unfortunately did terrible things to Hamza radiallahu anhu, who was the uncle of the Prophet. So with Muawiyah, he was a teenager when the Prophet ﷺ died, and he rose up through the ranks mainly due to his position, and he was also relatives with Uthman radiallahu anhu. He was governor of Egypt at the time under Uthman's reign, and he kind of stayed, not governor of Egypt, governor of Syria at the time of Uthman's death, and he ruled over those lands, and he gained very much a huge amount of support from those. And when Ali became caliph and didn't immediately go after Uthman's murderers, there was sort of an ill feeling, and there was something called the Battle of the Camel, which was mainly fought between, well, people say Aisha radiallahu anha. Of course, she wasn't the military leader, but she was the wife of the Prophet who stood against what Ali was doing. And the war was fought. This is another civil war of Islam, the first civil war of Islam, and Ali radiallahu anhu's forces became victorious. But it's crazy that you see, just merely not even 30 years after the Prophet's death, there was already infighting within Islam. It's not just them taking over lands, they were fighting within as well. And the sort of way that the caliphate was passed on, it wasn't what you see of empires where, okay, his son. It was, this person is the most righteous, so I'll pass on to the next person who's the most righteous, and the next person who's the most righteous, and the most righteous, so on and so forth. So you had these battles, and the Battle of Siffin between Muawiyah and Ali radiallahu anhu, which was another battle, huge battle that took place, of course. And eventually Ali radiallahu anhu was assassinated in the masjid, and his son Hassan radiallahu anhu, who was the grandson of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was declared caliph in Baghdad or Iraq. And when he was declared caliph, Muawiyah's army rose against him. And now Muawiyah, the man who wasn't even Muslim at the time of the Prophet's message, had taken over the entire Islamic caliphate over the grandson of the Prophet. And Hassan kind of steps away, steps down, doesn't become caliph. And what Muawiyah does is he makes many of the tribal leaders give him bay'ah. Bay'ah refers to the term of allegiance, giving himself allegiance. It's actually Muawiyah's reign that you see much of what you familiarize yourself with how Islamic empires ran after the Rashidun. So Ali radiallahu anhu was assassinated, and Hassan did not become caliph after properly radiallahu anhu. So now that was the end of the Rashidun Caliphate. The Rashidun Caliphate was the perfect caliphate, and how it was run and how it was supposed to be run. So now you had the end of that. Now you had the beginning of the Umayyad Caliphate, the Umayyad dynasty. This was the first time you ever had a dynasty in Islam. It wasn't a common thing, it wasn't a normal thing. This is now how it was done. The Umayyads was merely the family name of Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan, blah 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 blah, Umayyad. So the Umayyads, this is where you see what you familiarize or what you understand with sort of how you perceive Islamic history. You see the beautiful architecture Muawiyah was famous for his architecture. You see another naval expedition into Constantinople, the death of Ayyub al-Ansari. Muslims tried to take Constantinople in 660s or early during Muawiyah's reign, so 670s. I think 670. They tried taking Constantinople. It failed, but Ayyub al-Ansari is buried in Constantinople today, Istanbul, modern day Istanbul. You had early Islamic expeditions, or naval expeditions, which Muawiyah tried getting Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu to do, but Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu rejected. And you had much of Islamic expansion, but you also had consolidation of power. So Muawiyah now, instead of the other caliphs, when they took power, so for example Umar, Uthman, Abu Bakr, even Ali, it wasn't questioned that they deserve it. They deserve the title of caliph. It was sort of universally accepted because everyone knew that they were passed on. Even when Uthman became caliph and some people wanted Ali to become, Ali said, "This is the caliph," and they would sort of receive allegiance from them. But it wasn't really a sort of thing that, oh yeah, he would go and receive the kiss on the hand. But when it came to Muawiyah, he had to do that. Why? Because it wasn't sort of, I am the clear leader. It was, well, I'm the best option. And that's why he became the caliph. And he wanted to show off, I am the best option. And interesting stories about Muawiyah as he traveled around Jerusalem to all these famous Christian sites. You had many Christian monks and scholars write about Muawiyah, how he was sort of the king of the Islamic world. It wasn't used to describe the likes of Umar, Uthman, Ali, but the term king was used to describe Muawiyah. So why was it used to describe Muawiyah? It was mainly because he wasn't the sort of righteous four of Umar, Uthman, Ali and Abu Bakr. He was a Sahaba nonetheless, so we call him radiallahu anhu, but he didn't have the same status as them, and he had to show his position and how he deserved his position. And from there we get the Umayyad Caliphate and the beginnings of the Umayyad dynasty. And this is a dynasty because why? He made people pledge allegiance to his son Yazid. And from that you get the beginning of a dynasty where instead of it being passed on from person, I choose you, I choose you, I choose you, it's, this is my son, he's going to lead after me, and this is my son, he's going to lead after me. And the caliphate turns from this sort of Islamic perfect view of succession to a more natural and modern pluralistic sort of succession, as opposed to the Islamic form of succession, which is the perfect form of succession in any way, because there's no sort of lineage in terms of this person's my son, so he's automatically better than you. It's this person's the right man for the job, so he gets it. So that's where you are. You see how Islam began to fall in terms of its unity. You had civil wars and fitna, but you also see how Islam began to shift from purely a religious empire to more of a, now we have money, we have a state. Muawiyah's coronation when he became caliph is not just a coronation, he's like a sultan. And that's where you get the beginnings of an empire as opposed to merely a caliphate. The Umayyad Empire, the Umayyad Caliphate, they were of course one of the most powerful empires of its time. It expanded as far west as Spain to as far east as Pakistan. And it's in part due to Muawiyah that you had the foundations of a solid Islamic empire. You had them going into different regions across different seas, taking different lands. But nonetheless, this was the shift from that which was passed on in the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime, and it's where you get the separation of state and religion. Not saying that it's a secular society, but state was run in accordance to its religion nonetheless, but it wasn't like the two were interlinked completely like it was in the Caliphate of the Rashidun, where the state and the religion was like this. It was more so a bit separate, because you had, yes, we are Muslim, we are Caliphate, we are the rulers of Islam, but that doesn't mean that we can't enjoy wealth and we can't have an empire. And that's where you get the Umayyads. If you guys do want another video, because I know depending on what we're studying, because in the medieval world right now we're just doing early Islam in terms of Muawiyah, but if we are to study the likes of Yazid and others, I'll be happy to make a video, so please comment down below. This is it for today.